There are things that happen in the dark, in the sky, and in the empty spaces between what we understand and what terrifies us. Tonight, we are going to walk through some of the most disturbing cases in UFO history, cases where people didn't just see something strange. They paid for it with their lives. These are real, documented accounts, and every one of them will leave you wondering just how alone we really are. The sun had been setting behind the low, rolling hills of Goiás, Brazil, painting the sky a deep shade of burnt orange, when 41-year-old Inácio de Souza and his wife Luisa began the short walk home to the ranch where they lived and worked. It was August 13th, 1967, and by all accounts, it had been an unremarkable day on the fazenda in the rural stretch between the tiny towns of Pilar de Goiás and Crixus. The couple had walked this path hundreds of times before. The ranch sat at the end of a dirt trail that cut through dry, scrubby terrain, and attached to the property was a small private airstrip, a flat clearing of packed earth that the landowner used for crop dusting flights. It was a remote and quiet place, the kind of place where the loudest sound on any given evening was the chirping of insects rising up from the brush. Inácio was a simple man. He was illiterate but deeply respected in the community. The farm owner, identified only as ASM in research documents to protect his privacy, held Inácio in high regard. He was known as a dependable, hard-working foreman with a solid reputation and a calm temperament. He was the father of 5 children, married to a woman named Maria, and he carried a Winchester .44 caliber rifle on his walks between the village and the ranch as protection against the wild animals that roamed the Brazilian countryside. He wasn't the type to tell tall tales or exaggerate. He was, by every measure, an ordinary man living an ordinary life. And what happened to him that evening was anything but ordinary. As Inácio and Luisa approached the property, something stopped them cold. Out on the landing strip, 3 figures were moving around in the open. At first, Inácio assumed they were visitors, maybe friends of the landowner or locals from a nearby settlement. But the closer the couple got, the more obvious it became that these weren't people in any conventional sense. The figures were roughly the size of young children. They were completely hairless, their scalps smooth and pale, and they were dressed in tight-fitting suits of pale yellow that clung to their bodies like a second skin. They moved in a strange, almost playful manner, circling one another in the fading light, as though engaged in some kind of silent game. Inácio slowed his pace. His hand instinctively went to the Winchester at his side. Behind the 3 figures, at the far end of the airstrip, sat something far more unsettling. It was an enormous object, shaped like an upturned basin, or a massive inverted bowl, hovering just barely above the ground. Researcher Coral Lorenzen, writing for Fate magazine in September of 1971, described the object as approximately 115 feet in diameter. It gave off a low, persistent humming sound, like a swarm of bees trapped inside a metal drum, and the air around it shimmered, the way heat rises off asphalt in the midday sun. The object appeared to pulse faintly with an inner glow, and the entire scene, the figures, the craft, the humming, felt deeply and profoundly wrong. When the 3 figures noticed the couple approaching, they stopped their movements and began walking toward Inácio and Luisa. Not running, not gesturing, just moving with a deliberate, silent purpose that sent ice through Inácio's veins. Years later, Inácio would tell the farm owner that his first thought was that these small men were trying to kidnap his family. He yelled at Luisa to get inside the house, and in the same breath, he raised the Winchester and fired a shot at the nearest figure. Whether the bullet struck one of the beings is something no one can say with certainty. The accounts don't agree on this point, but what happened next would seal Ignacio's fate. At the precise moment the shot rang out, a jet of vivid green light erupted from somewhere on the underside of the hovering craft. It crossed the distance between the object and Ignacio almost instantaneously, striking him in the chest and head with enough force to knock him flat on his back. Luisa, who was still outside, later described the light as being as focused as a flashlight beam, but impossibly brighter, almost like a solid thing cutting through the air. Ignacio crumpled to the ground and didn't move. Luisa ran screaming to his side, snatched the rifle from his limp hands, and hurled it away. When she looked back toward the airstrip, the three figures had already retreated to the craft. They entered the object with a calm, almost mechanical efficiency, and within seconds, the craft rose vertically into the sky at a speed that defied anything she had ever seen. The humming grew into a deep roar that vibrated the ground beneath her feet, and then it was gone, swallowed by the darkening sky. Ignacio eventually regained consciousness, but from that moment on, he was a changed man. In the hours and days that followed, his condition deteriorated rapidly. Tremors shook his hands so badly he couldn't hold a cup. Numbness spread through his head and limbs, creeping outward from the point of impact. He was plagued by nausea that wouldn't let up, and blinding headaches that left him unable to stand or even sit upright. Where the green beam had struck him, a perfectly circular burn mark, roughly 6 inches in diameter, blistered across his chest and upper body. It was angry and red, and the skin around it appeared almost scorched, as though he'd been branded by something unimaginably hot. Luisa managed to get her husband to a physician in Goiânia, roughly 290 kilometers away, and what followed during the medical examination only deepened the horror. The doctor initially attributed the burns to contact with a toxic plant, a common enough diagnosis in rural Brazil. But when Ignacio and Luisa told the doctor what had actually happened, a proper blood analysis was performed. The results were devastating. Ignacio was diagnosed with an extremely aggressive and rapidly progressing form of leukemia. His blood was deteriorating at a rate the doctors had never seen in a patient with no prior medical history. The examining physician, perhaps understandably, dismissed the couple's account of the encounter as a hallucination. But the leukemia was very real, and it was killing Ignacio with terrifying speed. Within weeks, the once strong, capable farmer was a shadow of himself, gaunt and wasted, barely able to lift his head from the pillow. His body became skeletal, and yellowish-white spots, each no larger than a fingernail, erupted across his skin. He was in excruciating pain. Those who visited him in his final days recalled a man who seemed to understand, on some deep and terrible level, what had happened to him. He reportedly told Luisa to burn his mattress, his bed, and all of his personal belongings after he passed, as though whatever was inside him, whatever the green light had put there, might somehow linger and spread. On October 11th, 1967, roughly 59 days after the encounter on the airstrip, Ignacio de Souza died. The case came to the attention of the broader world through the farm owner, who contacted the Gaucho Group for the investigation of non-identified aerial objects, or GGOANI, a Brazilian ufology organization chaired by Dr. Felipe Machado Caron. GGOANI investigators documented the case thoroughly, interviewing Luisa, examining the site, and compiling a report that would eventually make its way to international UFO research circles. Coral Lorenzen of the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, or APRO, published details of the Crixus encounter in the United States, and the case drew attention from researchers around the world. UFO author Nigel Watson later wrote that while some ufologists believe the leukemia and the encounter were simply a tragic coincidence, an undiagnosed condition that manifested at a terrible time, others are firmly convinced that the green beam was an intense and concentrated burst of deadly radiation, and that Inaccio's death was a direct and deliberate consequence of being targeted by whatever intelligence controlled that craft. Watson noted that the circular burn pattern on D'Souza's chest was consistent with focused electromagnetic radiation, and the speed of the leukemia's progression from a healthy man to a corpse in under 2 months was medically extraordinary. And what makes Inaccio's story all the more unsettling is that it didn't happen in isolation. Brazil has an unusually long and well-documented history of hostile UFO encounters, more so than perhaps any other country on Earth. Researcher Bob Pratt, who spent decades investigating Brazilian cases, wrote that in certain rural areas, people don't just report seeing UFOs. They report being attacked by them, chased through fields, burned by beams of light, and in some cases, killed outright. Inacio de Souza's death sits squarely within that disturbing pattern. And just 2 years later, thousands of miles away in the mountains of Colombia, a remarkably similar event would unfold, and once again, a man would die after getting too close to something he didn't understand. It was the evening of July 4th, 1969, in the small farming community of Analema, a quiet area nestled in the hills not far from Bogota, Colombia. For several days prior, people in the area had been reporting strange lights in the sky, bright objects that moved with unnatural speed and silence across the darkness. Locals whispered about the sightings, but life carried on as it always did in the Colombian countryside, where strange lights in the sky were a curiosity, but not yet a cause for alarm. On that July evening, a man named Arcesio Bermudez was at the Casatejar estate, a country farm where he worked as the caretaker, surrounded by friends and family. There were roughly 13 people gathered at the property that night, including several children, and among them was a 13-year-old boy named Mauricio Gnecco, who had arrived at the farm with his aunt for a visit. The mood was relaxed. The air was warm. It was the kind of quiet, unremarkable evening you'd find on any rural farm in South America. Then, sometime after dark, the children noticed it first. Mauricio and 3 of his cousins, Andres, Marina, and Enrique, had ventured up to a nearby hilltop to look at the stars. It was as they were doing this that they first spotted a strange light in the sky, different from the stars, moving with purpose. The light descended, revealing itself to be a small object emitting an intensely bright glow, yellowish-orange in color, that lit up the trees in the surrounding fields as it dropped lower. As everyone stepped outside to look, the object began to make several erratic, darting movements above the house, as though surveying the property, before settling lower toward a nearby hillside. The cattle in the pastures began to bellow. The dogs barked wildly and then went eerily silent, their tails between their legs. Even the chickens set up a frantic racket that echoed across the farm. Everyone was terrified. Everyone, that is, except Arcesio. The 54-year-old caretaker was a man of stubborn courage, the kind of person who didn't back down easily. When the children froze, paralyzed by the sight, Arcesio snatched a flashlight from young Mauricio's hands and took off running toward the hillside where the glowing object had drifted. Mauricio, who would later become the case's primary witness and carry the memory of that night for the rest of his life, followed at a distance with a few of the other children. They could hear Arcesio crashing through the blackberry bushes that lined the fields, the beam of his flashlight bouncing wildly in the dark. The general distress of the cattle and chickens filled the air, along with the agitation of the family dogs. When Mauricio and the others reached the outskirts of the farm's outbuildings, they saw something that Mauricio would later describe as looking like a scene from a science fiction movie. There stood Arcesio, frozen in place, his flashlight aimed directly at a glowing, egg-shaped object that sat on the ground just a few meters away. According to accounts compiled by the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, or APRO, who sent investigators to Colombia after the incident, the craft was roughly 4 to 6 feet tall, resting on 2 short legs, and it emitted a soft, pulsating yellowish-orange glow. The silence was absolute. Even the insects had stopped. Arcesio reportedly called out to another adult on the property, a man named Luis Carbajal, shouting words to the effect of, "Luis, come here and look at this Martian." Some accounts, including statements Arcesio later made to his family, say he could see a small figure, a being of some kind, inside a transparent or glass-like dome at the top of the craft. He shone his flashlight directly at it. Then, according to the witnesses, the craft lit up with blinding intensity. One account, relayed through UFO researcher Scott Corrales, describes a beam of light that struck Arcesio and threw him backward through the air. Others, including Mauricio's own recollection, described the craft simply pulsing brighter and brighter until Arcesio stumbled away, shielding his eyes. Either way, the object then rose from the ground at tremendous speed, and Mauricio recalled the sight as something truly otherworldly. The craft climbing into the darkness and vanishing over the hills in the direction of Bogota. Everyone retreated to the house, shaken and confused. Arcesio seemed dazed, but otherwise uninjured. They went to bed that night, thinking it had been a strange but ultimately harmless experience. They were very wrong. Within 48 hours, Arcesio Bermudez was gravely ill. It started with a persistent, nagging coldness in his body that wouldn't go away. His temperature dropped well below normal, hovering around 95 degrees Fahrenheit, a reading so dangerously low that the doctors who later treated him were stunned he was still conscious and functioning. Then came the nausea, followed by violent bouts of vomiting, first food, then bile, and then black, tarry fluid that doctors recognized immediately as a sign of severe internal bleeding. His skin erupted in strange blue-tinted spots and lesions that no one could explain. He complained of agonizing pain throughout his body, and a crushing dehydration set in that no amount of fluids could reverse. Arcesio was rushed to a hospital in Bogota, where he was examined by 2 physicians, Dr. Luis Borda and Dr. Cesar Esmeral. Esmeral, who would go on to become Colombia's Minister of Health, would later declare the case entirely unique in his medical experience. Both doctors were baffled. When blood was drawn from Arcesio's veins, the samples exhibited an extraordinary and deeply unsettling property. According to the medical reports that followed, the blood had crystallized. It was no longer liquid in the normal sense. Whatever had happened to Arcesio at the cellular level, whatever the proximity to the craft had done to his biology, was something the doctors had never encountered before and could not explain. His body temperature continued to drop, and his internal organs began to fail one by one. On July 12, 1969, just 8 days after his encounter with the glowing craft on the hillside, Arcesio Bermudez died at 11:45 in the evening. He had been attended by Dr. Borda at 10 that morning and by Dr. Esmeralda at 7:30 that evening. The official cause of death was listed as gastroenteritis, a general term that covers a wide range of gastrointestinal illnesses. But investigators from APRO who traveled to Colombia to examine the case came to a different conclusion. They believed Arcesio had been exposed to a massive and lethal dose of radiation from his prolonged close proximity to the UFO. A former NASA scientist named Paul Hill, in his detailed analysis of UFO physics published in his book on unconventional flying objects, later calculated the radiation exposure Arcesio might have received. Hill estimated that if Arcesio had stood roughly 6 meters from the craft for even 10 minutes, his exposure could have exceeded 1100 Roentgen, a dose far above the 800 Roentgen threshold generally considered lethal for full-body exposure. In Hill's assessment, Arcesio was simply too close. Had he stayed at 200 feet instead of 20, he might have survived the encounter. But the strangeness of Arcesio's case didn't end with his death. According to several reports, including accounts gathered by UFO researcher Scott Corrales, Arcesio's body was exhumed at some point after the burial by an unidentified group. Who they were, what authority they operated under, and what they wanted with the remains has never been established. The incident drew national and international media attention at the time, with newspapers in Colombia running front-page stories about the mysterious death of the farmer from Anolema. APRO sent field investigators who took the case extremely seriously, and their general opinion was that Arcesio had been exposed to concentrated radiation that his body simply could not survive. Mauricio Gnecco, the 13-year-old boy who followed Arcesio up the hill that night with a flashlight and a child's curiosity, has maintained his account of the events for more than 50 years. He has described the experience as life-altering and has never wavered in his description of what he saw. The craft, the glow, the frantic flight into the sky, and the slow, agonizing death of a man who simply wanted to see what was making that strange light on his farm. Mauricio has given interviews and participated in documentaries about the incident, and he remains one of the most credible and consistent eyewitnesses in South American UFO history. For him, there is no doubt about what happened that night in Anolema. Something came down out of the sky. Arcesio got too close, and whatever energy that craft emitted destroyed him from the inside out. The official diagnosis of gastroenteritis, in Mauricio's view, and in the view of the APRO investigators, was a convenient label for something far more sinister and far less understood. And if the idea that radiation from an unidentified craft could kill a man in a matter of days sounds like something from the realm of science fiction, then consider what happened a decade earlier on a frozen mountainside halfway around the world, where 9 experienced hikers died under circumstances so bizarre that the Soviet government sealed the case files for decades, and the lead investigator himself came to believe that whatever killed those young people came from somewhere other than Earth. In late January of 1959, a group of 10 young, experienced hikers from the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, in the Soviet Union, set out on an ambitious winter expedition through the northern Ural Mountains. They were led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, an engineering student with a reputation for meticulous planning, confidence in the field, and deep competence as a mountaineer. The group planned to traverse a difficult route to a mountain called Otorten, a name that in the language of the indigenous Mansi people is said to translate roughly to "don't go there." The team was composed of 7 men and 2 women, all of them seasoned outdoor enthusiasts who had trained extensively for the journey. They carried cameras, kept detailed diaries, and even published a humorous handwritten expedition newspaper they titled The Evening Otorten. One of the headlines read, "From now on, we know that the snowmen exist." They were young, capable, and in high spirits. A few days into the trek, one member, Yuri Yudin, was forced to turn back due to a flare-up of sciatica and joint pain. He said goodbye to his friends, not knowing that he would be the only one of the original group to survive. The remaining 9 pushed on into increasingly harsh terrain and worsening weather. Their diaries and photographs from those early days show a group that was tired but determined, laughing and posing for the camera in the snow, bundled in coats and fur hats, fully alive and looking forward to the summit. On February 1st, 1959, the group made camp on the eastern slope of a mountain called Kolatsiakl, which in the Mansi language translates to Dead Mountain. It was an exposed, wind-blasted location, not an ideal campsite by any measure, but conditions had forced them slightly off their planned route. They set up their tent, cut into the slope to create a level platform and a windbreak, and settled in for the night. What happened over the next several hours has haunted investigators, researchers, families, and the general public for more than 6 decades. When the group failed to send word by their expected check-in date, search parties were dispatched. On February 26th, a rescue team reached the campsite, and what they found there stopped them in their tracks. The tent was half collapsed, partially buried in snow, and had been slashed open from the inside with a knife, as though the hikers had cut their way out in a desperate, blind, frantic panic. Their boots, warm clothing, food, and supplies were still inside. Whatever had driven them from the tent had given them absolutely no time to dress for the conditions outside. Temperatures that night had plunged to roughly -30 to -40 degrees Celsius. Footprints leading away from the camp showed that the 9 had fled in bare feet, or socks, some wearing only their underclothes, fanning out into the darkness toward the tree line below. The bodies were found over the following weeks and months, scattered across a wide area in a pattern that told a grim and confusing story. The first 2 were discovered near the remnants of a small fire beneath a large cedar tree, approximately 1.5 miles from the tent. They were Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, stripped down to their underwear, their hands blistered and blackened from desperately trying to keep the fire going in the killing cold. Branches of the cedar tree had been snapped off as high as 16 feet, as though someone had climbed it in a panic, perhaps trying to see back towards the tent, or to escape something on the ground below. 3 more bodies, including Dyatlov himself, were found between the fire and the tent, positioned as though they had been trying to crawl back to camp when the cold finally took them. Rustam Slobodin was among them, found face down in the snow, and Zenaida Kolmogorova was found frozen in a posture that suggested she'd been fighting to move forward with the last of her strength. All 5 had died of hypothermia. The medical examiner confirmed it. They froze to death. But it was the final 4 bodies, found more than 2 months later in May, buried under nearly 5 meters of snow in a ravine some 75 meters from the cedar, that turned the case from a mountaineering tragedy into something far more disturbing and far more difficult to explain. 3 of them had suffered catastrophic injuries that were incompatible with anything the investigators had seen before. Lyudmila Dubinina had massive chest fractures so severe that multiple ribs had been driven inward, crushing her heart. Her tongue was missing. Semyon Zolotaryov had suffered an equally devastating crush injury to his chest. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had a fractured skull. The pathologist who examined the bodies made a statement that has been quoted in nearly every account of the incident ever written. He stated that the force required to inflict these injuries was comparable to that of a car crash, and critically, he noted that there were no corresponding external wounds, no bruises, no abrasions, no cuts on the skin. It was as though some massive, invisible force had crushed them from the inside. He explicitly stated that no human being could have inflicted injuries of that magnitude using their hands or any conventional weapon. And then there was the radiation. Several articles of the victims' clothing, particularly those found on the bodies in the ravine, tested positive for elevated levels of radioactive contamination. This detail, combined with reports from people who attended the funerals that the bodies had a strange, deep brownish-orange tan on their skin, has fueled decades of speculation. The hair of several victims had reportedly turned gray. The Soviet investigation concluded, with a brevity that felt almost insulting given the horror of what had been found, that the 9 hikers had died due to a compelling natural force. The files were sealed. No further explanation was given. No guilty party was identified. The case was closed in May of 1959, and the documents were sent to a secret archive. But perhaps the most unsettling detail of all emerged over the years that followed, as other witnesses began to speak, and as the lead investigator himself broke his silence. Another group of hikers, camped roughly 50 kilometers south of the Dyatlov group's position, reported that on the night of February 1st to February 2nd, the night the group died, they saw strange, glowing orange spheres drifting silently through the sky to the north, in the exact direction of Dead Mountain. These were not fleeting glimpses. The spheres hung in the sky, moved with apparent purpose, and then vanished. Similar orange spheres were reported by multiple independent witnesses across the region, including military personnel stationed in the area, guards at the nearby Ivdalag labor camp system who were on duty around the clock, and observers from the local meteorological service. The sightings were so numerous and so consistent that they stretched from February through March of 1959 and covered a wide geographic area. The lead investigator on the case, a police officer named Lev Nikitich Ivanov, took careful note of these reports. He collected witness statements from soldiers, camp guards, weather observers, and other hikers, and the testimonies were remarkably consistent. A man named Atamanaki, a witness from a geological institute, reported seeing the same glowing sphere directly over Otorten on the night of February 1st. When Ivanov reported the strange aerial phenomena to his superiors, he received direct orders to suppress the information, close the UFO angle of the investigation entirely, and focus on natural causes. He complied, and the case was shut down. Ivanov kept quiet for 30 years. Then, in 1990, he published an extraordinary article in which he admitted that his investigation team had no rational explanation for the deaths, and that he himself had observed the same strange flying spheres in the sky above the mountains during the search. He wrote about how, when his team arrived at the site, they found burn marks on the branches of trees at the edge of the forest, but the marks had no concentric pattern or clear epicenter. He interpreted this as evidence that some form of directed, selective energy had been focused on specific objects, possibly people, rather than radiating outward from a single blast. His words, published decades after the fact, remain among the most chilling statements ever made by a government investigator. He wrote, I suspected at the time, and am almost sure now, that these bright flying spheres had a direct connection to the group's death. In 2019, Russian authorities reopened the case and concluded that an avalanche was the most likely explanation. But critics have pointed out significant problems with that theory. There was no physical evidence of an avalanche at the site. The slope of the mountain at the tent's location was not steep enough to generate one. The footprints leading away from the tent were orderly and consistent, not buried under displaced snow, which is incompatible with an avalanche scenario. And an avalanche, no matter how powerful, cannot explain the selective, crushing internal injuries with no external trauma, the radiation, the missing tongue, the gray hair, the orange skin, or the strange lights that multiple independent witnesses observed in the sky that very night. Yuri Yudin, the sole survivor of the original group, the man who turned back because of a bad knee, was asked years later what he would say if he could ask God just one question. His answer was simple and devastating. What really happened to my friends that night? The Dyatlov Pass incident remains officially unsolved, and the glowing orange spheres that drifted through the sky over the Ural Mountains on that frozen February night have never been identified. Whatever they were, wherever they came from, 9 people encountered them, and not one of those people survived. To this day, the mountain pass where they died bears Igor Dyatlov's name, and there is a monument in Sverdlovsk at the Mikhailovsky Cemetery dedicated to the 9 students who never came home. For decades, their families were buried in closed coffins and given no information about what had killed their children. The official version of events, when it finally became available after the fall of the Soviet Union, raised far more questions than it answered, and the idea that these lights, these objects, whatever they are, might be more than passive observers of human activity becomes even more disturbing when you consider what happened in the waters off the coast of Washington state in the summer of 1947, at the very dawn of the modern UFO era, when strange objects in the sky left a trail of wreckage, injury, and death that stretched from a quiet stretch of Puget Sound coastline all the way to a burning plane crash in the forests of southern Washington. It was June 21st, 1947, and the world hadn't yet learned to look up and wonder. The phrase flying saucer hadn't entered the public vocabulary. The Roswell incident was still weeks away, and for most Americans, the sky was just the sky, a canopy of blue above a country still settling into the uneasy peace that followed the Second World War. But on that warm summer afternoon, a man named Harold Dahl was out on the waters near Maury Island in Puget Sound, just south of Seattle, doing what he did most days, patrolling the coastline and salvaging stray logs from the water to sell to lumber mills. With him on his roughly 50-foot patrol boat were his 15-year-old son Charles, 2 crewmen, and the family dog, a loyal companion that Dahl took everywhere. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Dahl looked up from the wheel and saw something that would change his life and end the lives of others. 6 enormous objects hung silently in the sky above his boat, at what he estimated to be roughly 2,000 feet. They were donut-shaped, each approximately 100 feet across, with hollow centers, and they reflected the afternoon sun off metallic surfaces that gleamed silver and gold. 5 of the objects appeared to be circling the 6th, which seemed to be in some kind of distress, wobbling unsteadily and dipping lower than the others, as though struggling to maintain altitude. Dahl was transfixed, terrified, and the water around him suddenly felt very small and very exposed. Dahl ran the boat toward the shore of Maury Island, desperate to get his son and crew to safety on solid ground. But before they could reach adequate cover, the stricken object began to shed material. Chunks of dark, metallic debris and what Dahl described as a lava-like molten substance began raining down from the craft, splashing into the water around the boat, striking the wooden deck, and scattering across the rocky beach nearby. The falling debris was blisteringly hot. A piece of the metallic slag struck Charles Dahl's arm, burning him badly enough that he would require hospital treatment. And then, in an instant that Harold Dahl would carry with him for the rest of his life, another piece of the raining debris struck the family dog squarely. The animal was killed on the spot. It died on the deck of the boat while Dahl tried to shield his injured son, surrounded by the hiss and splash of alien metal hitting the water all around them. The dog was later buried at sea as the shaken crew limped back to the harbor in Tacoma. Dahl reported the incident to his employer, a man named Fred Chrisman, who visited the site the next day and collected samples of the strange metallic slag from the beach. But the very next morning after the encounter, before Dahl had told anyone beyond Chrisman, something else happened. Something that would become one of the most famous and enduring elements of the entire UFO mythology. A man in a dark suit, driving a new 1947 Buick sedan, appeared at Dahl's door early in the morning. Without introduction or clear explanation, the stranger invited Dahl to a nearby diner for breakfast. Dahl described the man as imposing, over 6 feet tall and muscular, with a manner that was calm but deeply unsettling. Over coffee and eggs, the man in the black suit proceeded to describe the Maury Island encounter in precise, accurate detail, as though he had been watching from somewhere close by. He knew about the objects, the debris, the dog, the burns on Charles's arm, all of it. He then warned Dahl, in words that Dahl understood as a direct threat, that for the safety of his family, he should never speak of what he had seen to anyone. If anyone asked, he was to say it was fiction, a story, nothing more. This encounter is widely regarded among UFO researchers as the first documented appearance of the so-called Men in Black in UFO history, predating the concept's entry into popular culture by decades. But the most tragic chapter of the Maury Island incident was yet to come. Word of Dahl's sighting reached Kenneth Arnold, the private pilot who, just 3 days after Dahl's experience, on June 24, 1947, would make international headlines with his own report of 9 gleaming disc-shaped objects flying in formation past Mount Rainier, a sighting that gave birth to the phrase flying saucer and launched the modern UFO era. Arnold traveled to Tacoma to investigate the Maury Island claims, finding the story compelling but confusing, and unsure what to make of the debris samples. Arnold contacted 2 Army Air Corps intelligence officers for assistance, Captain William L. Davidson and First Lieutenant Frank M. Brown. The 2 officers flew up from Hamilton Field in California to interview Dahl and Chrisman at the Winthrop Hotel in Tacoma on July 31, 1947. They listened to the accounts, examined the metallic slag, collected samples of the debris, and prepared to fly back to their base that same evening. In the early hours of August 1, 1947, their B-25 Mitchell bomber took off from McCord Field near Tacoma. Also aboard were 2 enlisted crewmen. Not long into the flight, somewhere near Kelso, Washington, the left engine caught fire. The 2 enlisted men parachuted to safety. But Captain Davidson and Lieutenant Brown stayed with the plane. According to the Army's final mission report and the accounts of the surviving crew, the officers remained aboard because the collected UFO debris samples were in the cargo hold, and had been classified as top secret material. They refused to abandon what they believed was evidence of something extraordinary. The B-25 plummeted into the forest outside Kelso and exploded on impact. Captain William Davidson and First Lieutenant Frank Brown were killed instantly. The headline of the Tacoma Times the next day reported that the plane might have been shot down or sabotaged, and the Kelsonian Tribune ran, "Flying disc investigators die in Army bomber wreck." The FBI launched a formal investigation into the entire Maury Island affair and quickly concluded, publicly at least, that Dahl's original story was a hoax. Project Blue Book chief Edward Ruppelt would later call it the dirtiest hoax in the UFO history. Under pressure from authorities, Dahl himself stated that the sighting was fabricated. But the story doesn't end with that convenient conclusion. A Washington State Senate resolution passed in 2017 on the 70th anniversary of the event acknowledged something remarkable. The resolution noted that the FBI's own investigative files contained a determination that Dahl's recantation, his claim that it was all a hoax, was itself likely a fabrication, made under duress to avoid further public scrutiny and the kind of intimidation that the man in the black suit had promised. The FBI's own agent concluded that Dahl did not actually recant his story, and that his claim of a hoax was the real deception. The Senate resolution honored the service and sacrifice of Captain Davidson and Lieutenant Brown by name, recognizing them as the first casualties connected to the investigation of unidentified flying objects. And so a teenage boy was burned, a family dog was killed on the deck of a patrol boat, and 2 decorated military intelligence officers died in a fiery crash while carrying evidence they considered too important to abandon. Whatever Harold Dahl saw above Puget Sound on that June afternoon in 1947, it left wreckage, injury, and death in its wake. And the truth of what happened has been buried under layers of intimidation, official dismissal, and deliberate contradiction ever since. Sometimes the encounters that prove most deeply disturbing are the ones that seem almost surgically targeted, as though whoever or whatever was responsible chose its victim with a kind of cold precision. That's certainly the impression left by what happened on a frozen stretch of the Mohawk River in upstate New York in the winter of 1968, where a teenage boy met a death so strange and so unexplained that it caught the attention of UFO investigators across the country and led to another chilling encounter with the men in black. In February of 1968, 2 young men in the small city of Scotia, New York, located just north of Schenectady, were making their way home late one evening when they stumbled onto something they couldn't explain. According to their account, which was later documented by Jennifer Stevens, a well-known and highly regarded UFO investigator based in nearby Schenectady, the 2 men came upon what appeared to be a flying saucer resting on the frozen surface of the Mohawk River. The object was unlike anything they had ever seen. They could make out the outline of a figure near the craft, a humanoid form dressed in what appeared to be a white suit, standing or hovering close to the ice. The men were terrified and fled the scene immediately. By the time anyone returned to investigate the following morning, the object and the figure were gone. But something else was found. The next morning, roughly 300 yards from the spot where the 2 young men reported seeing the UFO and its occupant, the body of a 16-year-old boy was discovered on the ice of the Mohawk River. He had been missing for only about 6 hours, a short enough window that under normal circumstances, his body should not have been in the condition in which it was found. He was frozen solid. His body was embedded deeply into the ice of the river, as though he had been pressed downward with tremendous force or extreme localized cold. The police who recovered him noted that his face was locked in an expression of absolute terror, eyes wide, mouth open, as though the last thing he had seen had been beyond comprehension. The police documented his footprints in the snow, and they told a disturbing story. The boy had been running, hard and fast, his footprints deep and evenly spaced in a pattern consistent with someone sprinting at full speed. Then, at a certain point, the pattern changed. One foot began to drag, leaving a long, scraping trail through the snow, as though something from above had taken hold of him and was pulling him upward. And then the footprint stopped entirely. There were no more tracks beyond that point, no indication that he had fallen, collapsed, or changed direction. He simply stopped moving forward, and the next thing anyone found was his frozen body, locked into the ice 300 yards from where a flying saucer had been seen just hours earlier. The official cause of death was listed as death due to exposure, which is technically accurate in the sense that he died from the cold, but the investigators themselves acknowledged that they could not explain the circumstances. They could not explain why the boy had been running at full speed in the dead of a New York winter. They could not explain why one foot appeared to have been dragged. They could not explain how his body had become so deeply and thoroughly frozen in such a short period of time. And they could not explain the connection, if any, between his death and the UFO sighting that had occurred in the same location just hours before. Jennifer Stevens believed the two events were directly and inextricably connected. She launched a formal investigation and, along with a group of researchers from a local UFO organization, spent several freezing nights patrolling the banks of the Mohawk River, looking for additional evidence and hoping for another sighting. On one of those nights, they got one. Stevens and her group observed a strange object moving low over the river, witnessed by multiple members of the team. The sighting confirmed, at least in Stevens's mind, that the area was an active site for UFO activity and that the boy's death was not a coincidence. But the case took a far darker turn in the days that followed. Jennifer's husband, Peter Stevens, was sitting alone in a cafeteria one afternoon when a man took the stool next to him. The stranger was described as having a dark, saturnine appearance, a word that suggests someone gaunt, severe, and deeply unsettling. Without any introduction or explanation, the man began discussing the Mohawk River UFO sighting with detailed, specific knowledge, as though he had been present during the investigation. He knew about the sightings on the river. He knew about the nightly patrols. He knew about the frozen boy. Peter was stunned, as he and Jennifer had been directly involved in the investigation, and this information was not public knowledge. When Peter tried to ask the stranger who he was and how he knew so much, the man evaded every question with cold efficiency. Before leaving, the stranger leaned close and delivered a matter-of-fact warning in a tone that left no room for interpretation. People who look for UFOs should be very, very careful. According to accounts compiled by multiple UFO researchers and published in the World of the Strange newsletter and other sources, Peter Stevens died suddenly and unexpectedly not long after this encounter. His death was described as abrupt and without clear medical explanation. Jennifer, shaken to her core by the loss of her husband and the circumstances surrounding it, reportedly abandoned her UFO research entirely. She stepped away from the field and never returned to the Mohawk River. The mystery of the frozen boy, his terrified sprint across the ice, the dragging footprint, the way his body was found locked into the frozen surface of the river, has never been solved. Who he was running from, what pulled him upward, how he froze so deeply in such a short window of time, and whether the craft on the ice had anything to do with his death remain unanswered questions to this day. And if all of this sounds like something from the absolute fringes of what we consider reality, something too strange and too terrible for any government to acknowledge openly, then consider the document that surfaced on the CIA's own website, a file preserved in the agency's public reading room that describes what may be the single most terrifying UFO encounter in recorded history, one that allegedly didn't kill just one person, but wiped out an entire platoon of soldiers in an instant and turned their bodies into something that wasn't even recognizably human anymore. The document appeared on the CIA's electronic reading room under the dry, bureaucratic title, Paper Reports Alleged Evidence on Mishap Involving a UFO. It was marked Unexplained, meaning unclassified, and its contents read like something torn from the pages of the darkest science fiction ever written. The file is a translation, originally reproduced from an article in the Ukrainian newspaper Ternopil Vechirny, dated March 27, 1993, which itself was reprinting a story that first appeared in the Canadian Weekly World News on September 8, 1992. The chain of sourcing is tangled, second-hand at best, and has given skeptics and debunkers ample reason to dismiss it entirely. Former CIA agent Tracy Walder has publicly stated that the document was not originated by the CIA and was simply a reprint of an open-source foreign media report collected by the Foreign Broadcast Information Service. All of that is true, and yet the story it tells, if even partially grounded in reality, is almost too terrifying to process. According to the document, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, a massive trove of formerly classified KGB files made their way into the hands of Western intelligence agencies, including the CIA. Among them was a 250-page dossier, complete with documentary photographs, detailed sketches, and the testimonies of surviving witnesses that detailed an incident alleged to have occurred sometime between 1989 and 1990 during a routine military training exercise in Siberia. The account goes like this. A Soviet military unit was conducting standard field exercises when a low-flying, saucer-shaped object appeared in the sky above their position. For reasons that were never explained, and without orders from any commanding officer, one of the soldiers launched a surface-to-air missile at the craft. The missile struck the object, and it fell to Earth not far from the unit's location, crashing into the ground with a force that shook the surrounding terrain. What happened next was witnessed by the only two soldiers who would survive to give testimony. 5 beings emerged from the wreckage of the downed craft. They were short in stature, with disproportionately large heads and oversized dark eyes. The surviving soldiers described what followed in nearly identical language. The 5 beings moved toward one another and merged, somehow fusing into a single spherical object that began to emit a loud, high-pitched buzzing sound. The sphere pulsed and grew brighter, expanding in size until it filled the immediate area with a light that the survivors described as blinding and all-encompassing. Then the sphere detonated. The flash was instantaneous and total. The 2 soldiers who survived had been standing in a shaded area at the edge of the formation, partially protected from the full intensity of the blast by an overhang or structure of some kind. Every other soldier was dead. But they weren't simply killed by heat or force or shrapnel. According to the KGB report, the bodies of 23 soldiers had been transformed at the molecular level. Their organic tissue had been converted into a calcium-based substance that, upon laboratory analysis at a secret research facility near Moscow, was found to be molecularly identical to limestone. The soldiers had been turned to stone. Not metaphorically, not in the way someone might use that phrase to describe shock or paralysis, but literally. Their bodies were composed of calcium carbonate, the same material you'd find in a piece of chalk or a slab of rock in a quarry. The document concludes with a quote attributed to an unnamed CIA representative. If the KGB file corresponds to reality, this is an extremely menacing case. The aliens possess such weapons and technology that go beyond all our assumptions. They can stand up for themselves if attacked. Now, it must be said clearly that this story has been met with enormous and understandable skepticism. The original source, the Canadian weekly World News, was a tabloid not known for rigorous journalism. The document is not a CIA-authored intelligence assessment. It's a preserved clipping. Snopes has rated the claims as unverified, but several facts remain difficult to dismiss. The CIA's Foreign Broadcast Information Service collected the document and preserved it in the agency's archives. The alleged KGB dossier, the 250-page file with photographs and eyewitness testimony, has never been produced publicly, but it has also never been debunked with counter-evidence or identified as a fabrication by any Russian authority. It exists in a deeply uncomfortable gray area, the kind of space where neither proof nor disproof can take hold, and the story lingers, disturbing and unresolved. And maybe that's the thread that connects every story we've explored tonight. In every case, from the sun-baked farmlands of central Brazil, where a farmer pointed a rifle at something he didn't understand and paid for it with his life, to the quiet hills of Colombia, where a man with a flashlight walked toward a light that would kill him in 8 days, from the frozen slopes of Dead Mountain, where 9 friends fled their tent into the darkness and never came home, to the waters of Puget Sound, where metal rained from the sky and a dog died on the deck of a boat, from the icy banks of the Mohawk River, where a boy ran from something that pulled him upward and froze him into the ice, to the frozen wastes of Siberia, where an entire platoon allegedly ceased to be human in the span of a single flash. The pattern remains the same. Someone encounters something they cannot explain. Something appears in the sky or on the ground. A light descends, a beam fires, and when it's over, someone is dead, and nobody in any position of authority seems willing or able to explain what happened or why. What we're left with are fragments, burned skin and crystallized blood, green beams and orange spheres, frozen bodies and limestone soldiers, sealed files and men in dark suits who appear from nowhere to deliver warnings. Whether these stories represent evidence of intelligence beyond our world, or whether they are elaborate constructions of human fear, coincidence, and Cold War paranoia, is a question that remains wide open. But for the people at the center of these encounters, the ones who didn't walk away, the question of what's out there stopped being hypothetical the moment the light found them. If these stories gave you something to think about tonight, or if they kept you company while the rest of the world was sleeping, consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Every like, every subscription, and every share helps this channel grow, so we can keep exploring the cases that nobody else wants to talk about. Thank you for listening, and sleep well.